My name is Amanda Moore. I'm a journalist who spent a year in the far right, and now I write about them.
Yeah, it's quite a story you have about the time you spent with them. Could you give us a brief overview of how, why, where, when?
Yeah, so during the pandemic, I owned a business in the live events industry. So obviously that went bankrupt, and I didn't have a lot going on. And unemployment does not really. It was not enough. Rent is a lot of money in DC. So I was pretty depressed. So I'd always wanted to be a writer, but it pays very poorly. And it turns out unemployment pays worse. So I went to a Stop the Steal rally after Trump lost the election. Um, I went to another one, recorded some audio for a podcast, and then I thought, oh, I'll go to this third Stop the Steal rally and maybe I can sell a little blog post. And that was January 6th. So I ended up being all in. I went down to CPAC, got recruited into a group that was working on a congressional caucus with some guys who love Hitler. And it kind of just spiraled out of control. And then I ended up getting doxxed. But I met a lot of people that I thought would end up probably being in the administration if Trump won. And lo and behold, I was right.
Could you give us an idea of what that experience was like being in a group with Nazis and not yourself being one, and how you kind of kept from drinking the Kool-Aid, I guess, as it were?
So I grew up evangelical. I'm writing a memoir, so I've had to like repurchase all of my old school books. So I have the kind of school books that were like, some people say that evolution made the moon, but we know that Jesus made it. So that kind of education, that kind of upbringing. And a lot of that is now, churches say that they have this problem where they have like these kind of extremists in their ranks and they have to kind of gently like pull people like back out. And so like those circles, I was already familiar with it. And then I had been a libertarian for many years. And until Trump won, sometime between Unite the Right, between Trump winning and Unite the Right, the Libertarian Party really kind of took this turn to what it is today, to the party of Trumpism, really. And so I've been around that a lot. I mean, people that I used to hang out with socially through politics were at Unite the Right, were at January 6th. And, I think it's like you're just so immersed in it, especially when you grow up in adjacent circles. You kind of, it doesn't have the appeal it might have otherwise.
Well, I wanted to kind of unpack some of that appeal because it seems like there's a big overlap between the evangelical community and kind of this radicalization to the far right. And can you, from your own personal experience, give us some insight into how and why that happens?
You know, I think that so there's also this like overlap between MLM, multi-level marketing, grifters, and then these grifters and these far right circles, these QAnon circles, or, whatever. You'll notice a lot of the cadence is the same. Some of them literally, there are influencers with hundreds of thousands of followers who got their start in MLM circles. And I think that also kind of crosses over into like this evangelical setting where you're used to being in a kind of a bigger church. You've got somebody, energetically and enthusiastically kind of preaching at you, and it literally you can hear like the repetition, the tone would just be so familiar to me. It would be like being back in school or back in church. But they would be talking about, uh, Donald Trump has to save everybody from the pedophile, so he must be president again, instead of, like Bible stories. I think there's also this like desire to be persecuted. I grew up believing that, if you could be Daniel cast into the lions, would you be cast into the lion's den, or would you be, like a traitor to God? And you kind of really want that pressure. You're pressured to want to be a victim, and you're also kind of told that every person you meet, you have to try to save their soul, and like it really like crosses over very well into this. I would go to these things. Obviously, it was during the pandemic. It was 2021, and I would go to these events, and people would talk about Donald Trump, and the way that I was taught to like talk about Jesus Christ. And it's like, I have to save you. I have to tell you like what Trump is going to do for you. I have to tell you. And it would be stuff like don't get vaccinated, because the vaccine will kill you. I have to save your life and tell you this. And it's, the other end of that is like, I have to save your soul. I have to tell you about Jesus. And I think it's very familiar. So if you already have that kind of evangelical background, and then you're faced with this, so much of the structure of it is like home. And the messaging, it gets mixed up. And this is something, I was at a couple weeks ago, maybe a month ago now, at a conference, Religious Freedom Summit, and it's a conference dedicated to this. It's mostly people who are religious. So you have like pastors and preachers talking about how they see this within their churches and what they have to do to kind of nip it in the bud, because it'll take over your church. Your church will become a QAnon church if you don't stop it from happening.
Well, it's fascinating to me because I've followed a lot of the kind of this underground percolation of alt-right and that kind of thing. So it's not a surprise to me to see it bursting onto the mainstream, like with RFK Jr. and the anti-vax stuff and all this. So for me, I've been like, oh, well, this is what he's been saying for years. But all of a sudden, it's mainstream and it doesn't have the same impact. It hits a little differently, as the kids would say. So but at the same time, there's a whole group of people out there who are cheering this on and sometimes disappointed that he's not going far enough. So could you talk to us about how you see the mainstream, larger political environment reacting to this as a journalist first, and then, or maybe as someone who thinks about it first, and then a journalist second?
Well, I mean, you can look at there's things in history. So right after Unite the Right, a bunch of websites got shut down, right? Because everybody was pretty much in agreement that Unite the Right was horrific. And some of those people would say things, especially about trans people, that you couldn't find it outside of those websites that ended up getting shut down. It was so shunned by society. Now you can go to CPAC and stand on the main stage and get a round of applause. And it's not been many years since Unite the Right. So it's shifted the way, it's certainly shifted the Republican Party, but it's shifted American culture too. I mean, we're still, ahead of where we were. Like we have not, banned gay marriage. Women can still have checking accounts. And typically undoing those things is unpopular. But there's also a segment of the MAGA movement that supports those things, supports banning gay marriage, supports not allowing women, to even vote. And today they're a minority. But, 10 years ago, other things were minority opinions too that are now the dominant opinions. So it's changed the way everyone views stuff. And I mean, everyone knows, all these Republican politicians who said, oh, Donald Trump is so bad. And then Lindsey Graham is out there voting for him and, campaigning for him. So it's changed that a lot. And I think interpersonally too, it's changed, I don't know, just the way people communicate with each other. And I think some of that's the pandemic. The pandemic made people ruder. But, I think you've got the president, he says whatever he wants. And you've got, like, I feel like if you were anti-vaccine, it used to be something you kind of were quiet about. And I don't even mean during the pandemic. I mean, 15 years ago, like people who were super opposed to, for instance, HPV vaccine, they were kind of like not the majority. And it was not something you wanted to necessarily brag about. But now it's like, whatever, who cares? Like RFK Jr., look at him, so.
Yeah, and I see it too as this online cultural voice coming to the mainstream and the media not really knowing how to respond to it and still treating it as though this is a presidential statement. And it reads like something you could see on 4chan or some sort of horrible message board. 8chan, I guess now 4chan's gone. But it's almost like there are two competing ways of talking about things and they're not talking to each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, I agree.
So let's talk about that online voice and who these guys are. Who are these podcasters? Well, I mean, we all know Alex Jones, obviously, now because of his famous last, trial with Sandy Hook, but there's a whole host of other really odious characters out there who are doing things that occasionally, well, in this administration, have become more ingrained. So if you would kind of just walk us through the heavy hitters, maybe Andrew Tate, Nick Fuentes, some of the other guys.
Yeah, I mean, Nick Fuentes is somebody that I have, like, I can speak best about him because I have kind of watched him for years. Nick used to work for Right Side Broadcasting Network. He had like a little show, and before that, he had done stuff at his high school and then briefly when he was in college. Um, and he left his school to go to Unite the Right for the weekend, and participated not in the Tiki Torch March, but the actual scheduled event. And RSBN fired him. He ended up like dropping out of college, like I think shortly after. And now he runs like this alt-right, media empire, at least in his mind. He's been deplatformed everywhere. So now he has like Alex Jones, he has his own website and hosting and storage that he uses so nobody can take him down. Um, he really has it's hard to watch, I think, for most adults because he is like so I mean, like when he started doing this, he was like very young and he's still quite young, but he's not that young anymore. But it's like clearly geared for like high school boys, which is like I'm not part of that demographic. um, but it's engaging and he is, personable. He's a good live streamer. And so, he's kind of got the tone. He's a Holocaust denier. He, thinks that women should not have jobs, should not vote. He wants to make America a Christian nation, all of these things. And he has had dinner with Donald Trump. And when Kanye West was talking about how much he loved Hitler on Alex Jones's show. Nick Fuentes is who was sitting next to him. And when Alex Jones would have questions for Kanye about his policy positions if he was going to run for president, Nick is the person who answered those questions. And so, he's got influence. A couple of years ago, he met with some very prominent people within the Texas Republican Party. And caused controversy, but nothing ever really happened. Nobody important lost their job or, lost access or power. And, he's got allies and friends working, as staffers in the Congress and the White House, wherever. And then you got Andrew Tate, who is just awful. He hates women. He has, these elaborate, like again, like clearly geared for high schoolers. These videos that are just so stupid. I actually can't stand to watch him because he's so, I think, ridiculous. And he's been, charged with rape, with all kinds of sexual assault in multiple places. Now in America as well. His now ex-girlfriend in California says that he beat her. And so you get it's called, the manosphere, this like very misogynistic, chauvinistic atmosphere, which is impacting, the demographic quite a bit. Like it's a lot of high school guys know who Andrew Tate is, and most of their parents have no idea.
You think that, I mean, as you said, these guys are very effective at using the media. They're engaging, they speak at a clip that is assured and no pauses. And it's just this like stream of constant hate and misogyny and all sorts of things. It's just, as you say, it's really hard to listen to. So how do they make it? How do people get to a point where they're not just coming out and saying, we hate women, right? There are tactics they're using. Like with Fuentes, he's always joking, right? He's never telling the truth. I'm a Nazi, but am I? That kind of thing. And could you talk about that and the way they structure their message in a way that kind of fits into what you were talking about earlier with the MLMs and the evangelical kind of box that they may be exploiting.
Well, you start to feel like you're in like a club, right? Like I mean, you have all these jokes, and you've got kind of like this community that is not going to be understood outside of your own community. And so like if I'm reading comments about Andrew Tate and people are like making in-group jokes, I don't get it. But if I'm reading comments about Nick Fuentes, I do just because I've seen so much of his show. Um, and and so you build a social structure like around this thing, this live stream. And that's, and a lot of times in like very strict evangelical communities are kind of doing the same thing where it's like if you leave the church, you're leaving everybody you care about behind. If you leave the misogyny and the anti-Semitism, are you leaving a lot of your friends behind? Probably, and it's designed to be that way. And I don't know about Tate, but for Nick, he'll do these streams sometimes it'll be like 7 hours long, and especially because of his age, he would be like 22, 23 doing this. It's a long tedious process to stream for 7 hours. You start to run out of stuff to talk about, but they can see the chat, so you can message them and they can see it in real time. And they'll get personal. Like it'll be, and it's like likely sincere. There's no reason to believe, and they'll say stuff they shouldn't say. They'll play clips they shouldn't play, and like that creates, well, like I really know him. You feel like this like very parasocial one-way connection with someone, and it's incredibly effective. I mean, just the idea of listening to someone's voice for 7 hours straight, even if you're not looking at the screen, is like you're going to start to feel like you know them a little bit. And so it works in this way where because it's entertaining and because sometimes it is personal, and you have the chat and you have this communication and then you have social media where it's like, you can go on TikTok and find a bunch of other Nick Fuentes fans. You can go on Twitter and find a bunch of Nick Fuentes fans. People form real relationships that move offline. And I don't mean like dating relationships, but like just like friendships and like and could be brought together through these live streams. And I've seen it play out where it's like happening to people who are in local politics, who know each other through Nick Fuentes live streams, for instance. So yeah, it's a whole community that could become your like full-time community.
And they're getting a lot of engagement, right? I mean, so I know Nick he has a name for his fan base and kind of gives them orders to go and harass people or maybe some, not orders directly because that would be problematic but he's, and can you talk a little bit about the fan base for Nick, especially, Fuentes, because he's got this Groyper thing and they all shout that. And you talk about one of his rallies where it's happening across the street from Turning Point. We probably should talk about Charlie Kirk in a minute, but talk about Nick's kind of attempts to be more mainstream than he is or bigger than he is.
Yeah, so Nick's fans call themselves Groypers, which fine. They're the Groyper army. And they have done stuff on his behalf. So years ago, Turning Point USA, which is what I think Evangelical and on alt-right, I think really Turning Point, because they're the ones with they've got flashy stages. If you go to a Turning Point event, it's like being at a rock concert. It's like Beyonce's gonna walk out, but then it's Ted Cruz, and you're like, ugh, you know, could have been Beyonce. So they'll have, very elaborate setups, and then they have this messaging, and a lot of it, nowadays is stuff Nick said a few years ago. But at the time, they were very anti-Nick, and they remain anti-Nick. And certainly their board remains anti-Nick if individuals within Turning Point are not. And they will, they would not allow Nick to come speak. They would not even allow him to be in the conference. He couldn't even buy a ticket. And so I think it was 2019, a bunch of Groypers would stand in line to ask questions and then ask questions about either Nick Fuentes or dog whistle kind of questions to bring Nick's beliefs into the Turning Point arena. And so one example of this is that there was a guy who came up and said, Charlie Kirk, I heard you got married in Jerusalem. I love Israel. The thing about Israelis is they're such great dancers. Just Google dancing Israelis. And Charlie had no idea what was going on. Charlie Kirk is the leader of Turning Point. He said, yeah, thank you. Thanks, man. I had a great time at my wedding. And if you Google dancing Israelis, it's actually a 9/11 conspiracy theory that is baseless, that suggests that, there were dancing Israelis when 9/11 happened. And so it's like pretty obscure sometimes, or at least it used to be obscure stuff. But that was the tactic they would use. And then Nick would stream it and his reaction to the Q&As. And then most recently, over the summer, he launched a campaign against Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita, who were managing the Trump campaign, and had people emailing them their complaints about not being Kuiper enough. And so it's effective. People send the emails. They show up for him. I mean, he really can get people to do stuff. He can mobilize.
And I've read other articles and heard in other media sources that a lot of the brokers are trying to get into government. And I was wondering with Project 2025 and that open call for, like, put your name on the list so we can hire you when Trump's reelected. How many of the people you think staffing the government right now would at least have heard of Nick Fuentes, maybe are adjacent to this ideology? Turning Point, of course, has gotten more and more right. Where do you think we are as far as who's in our government and how many of them have come out of this manosphere alt-right space?
So if you're a Republican under the age of 35, and I do not mean if you are a registered voter who shows up and votes, if you are an active Republican and you are under the age of 35, I would say there is a 1% chance that you don't know who Nick Fuentes is. And that is being extremely generous. If you are in a young Republican club, you know who he is. If you are trying to run for office, you know who he is. It just is what it is. So they all know who he is. I will tell you, I was reading, these articles about journalists not knowing who was going into Mar-a-Lago. Oh, we have no idea who is going to be working in the White House. And I'm like, I know that guy, I know that guy, I know that guy. And how do I know them? I either knew them undercover or I knew, within their social circles when I was undercover. So it's a great deal. You also have this issue now where a lot of Republican consultants, people who worked the first term with Trump, don't want to do it again. They think the first time was fine, but this time is going to be toxic. Even people who still support Trump feel this way. And so I think, it really starts to strip back. And then you have people who were like, maybe not necessarily qualified for the jobs they are getting, but they are willing to take them. I mean, it's people who are not eligible to work at the White House are still able to get interviews to work at the White House. And by not eligible, I mean like interpersonal conflict, like with the president in some cases. And so I think it's a high percentage. And I mean, one of the guys that was at that Turning Point rally that I was at last summer, where Nick was across the street, I mean, he's now a lawyer who is the White House liaison to the Department of Homeland Security. And he was also working with Andrew Tate. So it's, it really is just kind of taken over the White House at this point.
Well, and I think probably the biggest, most visible manifestation of this is Elon Musk, because in many ways, Musk has been radicalized by this space too. I mean, you can make the argument he's always kind of been to the right, but I mean, throwing up a Sig Heil at the Madison Square Garden, which I'd love for you to talk to us about the significance of that rally and that whole thing. But what's going on with Doge? Who are these people? Why is Big Balls, who's particularly, I mean, he's said Nazi things. Why is he allowed to continue? You know where I'm going with this.
So Doge, I mean, it's a little in the weeds. So basically, there's this guy named Curtis Garvin. And you can think of everything like tech accelerationism, right? So it's like the reason, you have like the government being dismantled and, you have people saying, oh, they're just trying to to move fast and sometimes you break things. Well, breaking things is actually the purpose here, right? Like they're not trying to fix Social Security, they're not trying to fix Medicaid, they're trying to destroy it. And it's all like based on this random guy's beliefs. And of course, Vice President JD Vance is a fan of Curtis Yarvin and has been for a while. So at CPAC this year, people who are affiliated with Yarvin, there's this group called Sovereign House. It's a event space in New York, and they had an event down here in DC after CPAC. It was a Doge appreciation party. And it's, basically just networking events to get a job at the federal government within, like that Doge like kind of sphere. And so, yeah, I agree. I think that Elon Musk was always to the right, but I think that like Twitter, he has radicalized himself through Twitter. And it's only gotten worse and worse. And there's like several right-wing like figures who are fairly prominent who I think did not used to be what they are now, and had Twitter not come into their lives would not be the people they are today. And so it's a very big problem. We're very susceptible to propaganda. But yeah, I mean, Doge's whole thing is just to destroy. And so I think that the beliefs that Big Balls has, that what the things that he said when he was so young 6 months ago or whatever, um, if you wanted to root that out of Doge, if for instance you had walked into that Sovereign House pro Doge party and kicked out everybody who had those beliefs, maybe 20 people would be left. And they would be the ones who didn't know what they were at. Um, so yeah, I think it's just you can't kick out everybody if it's the dominant view, can you?
Right. And I mean, that's what I'm, it's unbelievable to think that this is the case. And I think that a lot of people are still fighting the idea that these beliefs have become so embedded in our government. And I mean, like even knowing that Doge goes back to a cryptocurrency that, Elon was benefiting from pumping up. It was just in joke after in joke after in joke. But there's a real ideology there as well. And that's the thing I think people are having a trouble. At least when I've brought it up to people who don't follow this, they think I'm a conspiracy theorist or I have some sort of like crazy idea about what the world is. But I mean, you've sat at tables with these guys, you talk to them, your mutuals on X or whatever, Twitter. I guess my question is like, how do you talk to people who don't believe what you're talking and telling them?
I mean, like I know people who were at that douche party. I have people who talk to me, multiple people. None of them know each other. They don't even know, like, I mean, I presumably they know I'm talking to more than one person, but like they don't even know that I am, not necessarily. And independently, they like each kind of told me like everybody here hates federal workers. Everybody at that party was talking about them like they're cockroaches who have to be like eliminated, and things like that. And it's just like I mean that's maybe it's a vast conspiracy, And my sourcing for that party is across the board. It's people who are pro Hitler. It's people who are anti Hitler. It's people who had no idea what kind of party they were showing up to. And so for them to all say the same thing, with some of them not having any idea what the ideology is, I I mean, it kind of like rings true to me, right? Like it is that party was like a celebration of the destruction that they had done up until that point. And that it's not that the ideas, it's not that we had the government and then the ideas seeped into the government. It's that people were yanked out and replaced with people who had those ideas. It's not spreading, necessarily like government employee to government employee, but it's people are being positioned into the government because of those beliefs, right? And some of them are holdovers from the first Trump administration, and then others are people who like I'm literally going back to pitches I sent out to editors in 2023 that got rejected. And I would be told these people are never going to matter. Well, hi, this person just got a job at the Pentagon. Did you want to reconsider taking this pitch? And so it's very strategic. So it's not like you have a bunch of innocent random people who are like falling for these ideas within these high, status or high important jobs. It is that they are being set up to be this way. And so I think that might make it a little bit easier to understand and to believe, because I do think it sounds crazy to be like, oh, this spam email is going through the White House and everybody's a Nazi or whatever. And then it's also a lot of this stuff is like they say it. They say things. A lot of what Trump is doing, he said he was going to do. I spent inauguration at the DC jail because I knew Trump was going to pardon every single January 6er. And how did I know that? He said he would, like 10 times. And then there's still people who were surprised that it happened. I'm like, I didn't even show up to work until like 7 p.m. because I knew it was going to be a nighttime activity. Um, so yeah, I just have to like kind of, I think, look back at the stuff that has happened, um, and realize first we were told it was going to happen, and then second, look at all the changes that preceded it to make it a reality. Um, as far as the beliefs, like the words are what they are. I mean, the private chats leak. In my case, when I was undercover, I had like 400 hours of audio I recorded, but then I've also, in the time since, been given private chats about those from those people. And they're pretty consistent. And so someone says the same thing over and over. It's really, in the case of big balls or whatever, if you're going to say stuff, we're going to give you a second chance to let you keep your job, even though you said like kind of Nazi stuff. Isn't there someone who didn't say Nazi stuff who could take his place? I mean, is there really just not another candidate? Is that what the situation is? Because at some point it's a choice. It goes beyond forgiving someone's far youth past of 6 months ago and into a deliberate decision to embrace that ideology. And I think that's like clearly where we are at this point.
And as you were describing it, it puts a new meaning on the Great Replacement, right? Because you're taking all these government workers, federal workers who have been there for careers, and you're replacing them with these people, radicalized youth, really, and it's a troubling. But how do you explain to normies, I suppose, that this is real? Because it seems so fantastical that there would be this many people who believe this, and that they would be hired, and that the systems in place aren't weeding them out. And you give some really good examples of people who have been able to scam their way into or past the guardrails, kind of. But do you think that how would you talk to someone who's never heard of Nick Fuentes? No one doesn't really understand what Elon Musk is all about. How do you bring someone in to see the reality of that movement? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I always start with Hitler because it's kind of like, I mean, most people don't like him. And if you do, then it's not worth continuing the conversation. So I always try to start with like making it clear I'm not talking about all Republicans. I'm not talking about all MAGA. Like, here is the subset of people. Here is this guy. His name is Nick. And like, Kanye West has helped with this because now I can be like the guy that was sitting next to Kanye West when he was like, I love Hitler. And kind of introduce, that. And it's just like, here's like four of the worst things about Nick Fuentes, doesn't believe, he's a Holocaust denier, women shouldn't have jobs, Jews shouldn't be in the government. Okay, great. Let's go from there. And you kind of use that as your base, and then you can say, okay, well, this guy who just got appointed to chief of staff of the FCC, Gavin Wax, he actually really advocated for Nick Fuentes, and here are some of the other things that Gavin has said and done, and you really just gotta pick one thing. You gotta pick whatever they're going to most resonate with. If it's going to be Elon Musk, you go with Elon Musk. If it's going to be Nick, you go with Nick. And you can explain like a couple of people that are followers of them who are now like in the White House, or you can explain some of the things that Elon Musk has said or done in the past. And it's just like tiny little battles, because maybe next time they see an article online or they're whatever, they'll read it or listen to that segment on TV. But there's just like, you can't convince people, like you cannot get them from 0 to 100. It has to be like, just step by step by step.
Right. And, I wanted to do a discussion on Project 2025 before the election, and I was told that it didn't matter anymore. People weren't paying attention to it, and now everyone's like, why aren't you doing a project? So yeah, hopefully some of those pictures will go through. But I want to talk now about J6 and the pardon and Ed Martin, because you've done some great reporting on the lawyer who was helping get some of these guys off before the pardon. And talk to us about how January 6th, Charlottesville, there's a through line. It's not direct, but there's a growing momentum that led to January 6th. You know, the Charlottesville, the evangelical kind of white nationalism that started to come into play, and then boom, election denialism. So could you walk us through that story?
Yeah, I mean, you've got this like pent up rage over progress and change that kind of manifests itself in various ways. It's a lot of the same players. I mean, like, I think that going to the Tiki Torch March in Charlottesville is absolutely a hard line for me. And I know I'm not the only person that feels this way in my line of work. That is like something, if you were at the Tiki Torch March, you were doing a white supremacy march. Like that's it. That's the end, you know? I do not feel that way about everybody at January 6th. If you're January 6th, there are plenty of people there who were not going to kill Nancy Pelosi. There were plenty of people there who, you know, were not, they were there because they believed that Donald Trump won the election and was being denied. But that does not mean they were going to do violence. And it does not mean that they are white supremacists. But then there's other people, January 6th, who were really going to do something, and who did not necessarily believe Trump won, but wanted to push the idea that he had to get him into power because they believe that he is the best thing possible for white supremacy when it comes to presidents. There's not a better option. So it's like complicated. So I think, you know, people showed up to J6. Doesn't mean they're bad people by any means. But generally, if you went to the T George March, that's like really segregating some of the worst. But it is that same like push where it's like we've been disaffected and you know we're angry about it. And it kind of boils up, and the next thing you know, you're in the Capitol. You're not supposed to be. Um, and I think the way this is played out is that pardoning the J6ers was immensely unpopular. It polled very poorly before it was done. But once you're president, who cares if it's popular or not? If you're going to do it, you're going to do it. And it's, you know, there are 14 of them who have not been pardoned. They've only had their sentences commuted. But by and large, it didn't really matter what you did that day. You were pardoned. And Ed Martin, who is now my district attorney, as well as the U.S. attorney for Washington, D.C., because we are not a real state. So he's my DA. Yay. He was there January 6th, called a Mardi Gras, and he has been advocating for J6ers as an attorney for pretty much the whole time ever since. He was involved in organizing the Stop the Steal rallies. He was a speaker. He was close friends with Ali Alexander. And, you know, now he's been rewarded by being given a position that he is objectively not qualified for.
You're talking about the gentleman he was advocating for. I can't even begin to pronounce his last name, but who, you know, there's video of him dressed up like Hitler and all sorts of things, and just why Ed Martin is so problematic, not only advocating for some of the non-pardoned worst of the worst J6ers, but you know, he's got a problematic history of his own, right?
Yeah, so Tim Hale Cusalini, I think is, I don't know, I've always referred to him as Tim Hale, because that's how he refers to himself. But he dressed up like Hitler. He had this like show that he would do on YouTube. It was just, you know, offensive stuff. And so his excuse now is that it's comedy. But he had like the Hitler mustache, the whole nine yards. And gets arrested for January 6th. And his fake aunt, Cynthia Hughes, starts this nonprofit called Patriot Freedom Project. And Ed Martin is on the board, and he's very involved with Cynthia. Um, and she does it because her fake nephew, Tim Hale, is in jail, and she does not like that. And I mean, they were raising money to provide for J6ers to get their to buy groceries for their wives and kids who weren't in jail, to raise legal defense funds, like whatever. But the group exists because of Timothy Hale, who again dressed up like Hitler. And Ed Martin was like a founding board member. So he spends years advocating with them. He's doing events at Bedminster, Trump's, golf course up in New Jersey. He's doing all these live streams. He's also like working for Phyllis Schlafly Eagles, which is a Phyllis Schlafly group he kind of took away from half of her kids. The other half of the kids like went with him. And it's all on behalf of Tim Hale. And at the same time, he's advocating to, get all of these 1512 convictions thrown out. He's went on podcasts. He's really advocating for everybody, but like Tim Hale is the reason that this all happens. And that becomes his like career path. And he, you know, he has, since he has taken over the position of, like I said, there are 14 people who are not pardoned. He has gone to a fundraiser where Tim Hale was a fellow speaker. He flew down on a workday. Tim Hale was a speaker, so was Ed Martin. People at the fundraiser include oath keepers who were not pardoned and are actively appealing their convictions with Martin's office. So he left his subordinates at work to possibly work on these very cases while he flew down to Florida to pal around with people who are in litigation with his office. He has worked to get Stuart Rhodes, because his sentence was commuted, he was still not allowed in DC. And he came to DC anyway and intervened to allow him to be here, to be at the Capitol. So he was clearly an advocate more than a lawyer.
Yeah, and he's on deck to be confirmed as the U.S. Federal what is it, attorney for the DC. So I want to talk about Luke Meyer and the group that he was part of. What was it, that Trump Force 47? And I have two questions that come to mind. Like, I want you to tell the story, but then I also want to know, why do these people confess to you? What is it, do you think, that they why do they just own up to it? And I don't, that's the thing that I don't understand.
Okay. So Richard Spencer, who was very involved in Unite the Right, as well as other white nationalist activities around the country, especially in 2017, has a podcast now. He's been, knocked down from CNN to podcasting. And so he has a co-host who was going, by Alberto. And so Alberto is kind of like a yes man. He was clearly very young. And just like loves Spencer, like loves Richard. And they would do these podcasts, talk about horrible stuff. And then Alberto would go on other white nationalist podcasts. And he didn't really get to say much on the podcast he did with Richard, because he was too deferential to him, and so he'd always just be like, I agree, Richard, with everything. And that's like not really a conversation. But he would go and like spread the word of like Richard Spencer's beliefs to other white nationalist podcasts. And just say stuff like, I mean, one thing was like, not every Black is going to be Ben Carson, and even if they are, what if their kid is like, not a good Black, like things like that, like bad stuff, disparaging stuff about Indian people, especially JD Vance's wife. And so I one episode of the podcast, he said that he had been at the Butler rally where Trump was shot. And then like a week or two later, I get a message and someone gives me his real identity. And I'm like, okay, cool. So I spent months trying to figure this out. Of course, I'm freelance, unfortunately. And I really couldn't sell work at all before inauguration. It was very difficult for me to get stories to be placed. So it's not like I had like a budget, or like help. Um, so I was like, could not justify going up to one of the events that I knew that this guy would be at to confront him. But as time went on, I just saw too many connections. They shared a birthday. I pulled court records, and the real guy, whose name's Luke Meyer, shared a birthday with Alberto. There were other things. And then one weekend, Luke, the real guy, his girlfriend's mother posted photos of him in West Virginia. on a little day trip they had taken. And that same day, the Alberto personality tweeted that he was in the same town in West Virginia. And then there was a photo that Alberto posted, and I was like, that's the Trump Force 47 office. I know that place. So I got a rental car like 2 weeks before the election and drove up to an event and confronted him. And he like didn't really agree to it in person, but when I got back, I called Richard after I had sold the story. I called Richard. I was like, "Look, I'm doing this. Was he? Did you know it was him? Did you know he like what he was doing? Blah blah blah." And he owned up to it. And then a couple hours later, Luke finally replied to my email with like a long screed. I think there's a lot of reasons that they talk to me. For some of these guys, I mean, for many of them, I you might not have known me, but you knew someone who knew someone who knew someone who knew me. Like it's like you're only a couple degrees away from me because it's not like a huge community. And I knew in this case there was some confusion. I had not introduced myself as a journalist when I confronted him because I was like on private property up a hill with my car boxed in. I mean, it just wasn't safe. And some outlets expressed that they would not take it. And I was like, we can work around this because they know I know, and we can get them to agree. And kind of people didn't really believe me, but they do. I don't know why. I think there's like, if you're gonna get caught, it's probably better for me to write it up than someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. Like at least go out in glory, like at least get it like done correctly. But it really is a weird relationship. I mean, some of it's from being a woman that's in this like space, but there's other female journalists they don't talk to the same way. So yeah, I don't know. It's been a lot of time wondering about this myself.
Well, I mean, I think it makes sense on a kind of just basic human level, but it doesn't make sense on an ideological level. And it kind of speaks to almost a desire to have, I think he says at one point in the piece too, or in his creed that was like, I can finally now come out as who I am. And it reminded me kind of how other identity politics, what they would call identity politics. People talk about their moment of coming out, right? Like now I can finally be me. I can be the Nazi that I always meant to be, and it's horrible. But it's somehow I think it's a weight lifted off of them in a way. So I have kind of wrapping this up. How do you have this kind of, as you alluded to, you kind of have this space where you've been a fellow traveler alongside them, not necessarily agreeing but how have you stayed sane? How have you maintained a sense of non, you know, an objective outsider looking in? Because as you said in your article about you were a part of the movement, you were documenting at the same time, but there were things that you know, were also doing. So what do you think is the secret to your sanity?
I live in DC, so like, well, it's not as good now, but when I was like actually undercover, I would come back and it would be like I wasn't going home to somewhere that was like my friends, half of them voted for Trump or something. It's like locally, my friends who live near me, especially the ones who didn't leave DC during the pandemic. Like it's, like everybody's like, yeah, I don't like Trump and I think COVID's real. And so I had like that. I wasn't, like going somewhere I'd be surrounded otherwise. Like it doesn't bother me. Like part of why I don't listen to Andrew Tate is that I just cannot stand to do it. Like I know what my limits are and I know what does and does not upset me. Like I I don't focus on the things that are like necessarily like about women, right? Because that would be exhausting. It would be personal and too much. Like I am white. I'm, not Jewish. Like there are like certain things where it's like it's easier for me to listen to it. And obviously not because I agree with it, but just because it's like not a direct attack on me. And if you're gonna submerge yourself in this, you have to know like where your limits are to not like raise your blood pressure. I mean, it's really what happens is that I think things are common knowledge that everybody knows, and it's like nobody knows what I'm talking about. I mean, like the pardons, where it's like everybody knows the pardons are happening. What? And so yeah, it's just I keep that distance from stuff that would actually really upset me on a like me level. Um, yeah, it just and there's not really a very good answer for this because like I don't think I changed much in my life to accommodate it because it's like really when you grow up, I mean like I grew up with my dad, like I'm vaccinated, but like I wouldn't have gotten any vaccines as an older kid. I know that, right? Like, you just you just submersed in it all the time. It kind of just kind of rolls off your back. So that's not really a great answer, but it's what I got.
And as long as you work for you, you keep doing the work because you're exposing a lot of the stuff that needs to be brought into light. And I think that that's fantastic. So your work's important, and it's really good. I followed you for years. So,
Thank you.
anything you would like to talk to promote your pluggables, as they say, I guess.
Oh yeah, I've got a Substack. It's turtlediaries.com. And then I'm no turtle soup 17 on all social media. And that's where I try to share my work that I publish elsewhere too, so that you can kind of see all the stuff I do.